Hi, I'm Dr. Debi Luke. I'm the Senior Vice President of Conservation here at the Florida Aquarium. For Hope is really an exciting event where we can share with you all the great things we're doing in a collaborative nature to help conserve Florida's coral reef. Florida Aquarium plays a really important part in coral conservation, but we're one player. There are a lot of tools in the conservation toolbox, if you will. Our focus is on caring for species that have been removed from the wild and brought into our care, into our human care, to protect them and keep their genetics in place, if you will, so that we can breed them and replace them back out in the wild. That's one area of our hope. The other area is that we induce spawning of many of these corals. So we have spawning in our greenhouses, but we also have a really unique laboratory where our scientists are able to mimic the exact conditions that are found out in Florida's coral reef. From salinity to temperature to moon phases, we have it all computerized where the corals that are placed in this lab go through the same cycles as the reef all year long. Typically, what scientists will do during normal spawning seasons is they send a variety of divers out. This can be all evening, oftentimes till 3 or 4 in the morning, where divers are out in the dark waiting for corals to spawn 1, 2, 3 nights in a row, hoping it'll happen with nets. And as the corals start to spawn, they collect the gametes and then they bring them back into shore. And then they work for hours combining those gametes together to produce larvae. Then they have to travel with that larvae to the different facilities and then take care of them at those facilities and get them situated. This is an enormous amount of work. What we've been able to do at the Florida Aquarium is by mimicking those conditions in the Keys, we're able to induce the spawning in a laboratory setting. We've reversed the cycles so that it's 12 hours apart so that they actually spawn during the day at the same time that they would have spawned in the actual natural environment. Our staff are then able to do all that work right in the same place without having to have the divers going out every night, putting those gametes together, bringing them back in, trucking them across the state. We can all do it in our laboratory. This is amazing work, and we're really excited to be able to share some of the things that we're doing with you as we show you our Florida Aquarium Center for Conservation. You're going to get to meet Keri O'Neil, who is our senior coral scientist. She's going to take you on a tour of the laboratory and of our greenhouses where we care for all of these corals. And I hope that you'll take the time to listen to what she has to say, look around in the environment where she is. She's going to be available for questions afterwards, and really think about what you can do to help save corals and contribute to saving Florida's coral reef. We'd love to hear what your hope is for Florida's coral reef in the future.
Hi everyone, I'm Keri O'Neil, Senior Scientist here at the Florida Aquarium Center for Conservation in Apollo Beach, Florida. This site is a 20-acre property and it's a public-private partnership between the Florida Aquarium, Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, the Tampa Electric Company, and the University of Florida. On site we have educational facilities, a new fish hatchery that's opening soon operated by FWC, a sea turtle rescue program, and our coral conservation program. Behind me is our Sea Turtle Rehabilitation Center. And inside, we have our Project Coral Spawning Lab. And I'm gonna take you in there to look at some of the ways that we induce coral spawning ex situ. This is our Induced Coral Spawning Laboratory. In this room, we are actually mimicking all of the seasonal cues that a coral needs to induce its reproduction. So although corals only spawn usually one time a year, it's actually almost a full year of seasonal changes that induce that coral to start to produce eggs, which are then released once a year. So we mimic things such as the sunrise and sunset, the lunar phase, then the seasonal water temperature change, so that these corals in this tank actually think, for all they know, that they're living in the Florida Keys. So we take data that's available online and we program it into our computer control systems, where these computers are actually telling the lights and the heaters and the chillers in the aquarium when to come on and off and when to start getting brighter and getting dimmer, so that these corals really do get all of the cues that they would get in the ocean. So we've had 2 years in a row, we've had the pillar coral and the maize coral both spawn synchronously with exactly how they would in the wild in this laboratory. The only difference is we've actually switched day and night, so these corals actually think that it's about 8 hours ahead of time, so you can see that the sun has already set. Even though it's about noon here in Apollo Beach, the sun has already set for these corals. So this way we can monitor for spawning and collect their eggs and sperm during our normal workday. This becomes really important for some species that we don't know when they spawn in the wild, or we only have a very broad window of time to look. So the maize coral, for example, there were no observations from the state of Florida on when this coral spawns. So by putting it in this laboratory, when we had about a 3-month window to look for spawning in this coral, and what we could do is every day we shut off the water flow to the aquarium during a certain time period, and then we just come in and check and see if any eggs have released. And sure enough, we did finally observe it spawning about 14 days after the full moon of September, which is a little bit different timing than most of the other coral species. So having spawning happen during the day gives us an opportunity to learn when species spawn when we're not sure exactly when they would spawn in the wild. And we've spawned 4 different species of coral in this laboratory. We've had our first one successful spawning was the Atlantic pillar coral. And then we had followed by the maize coral. And then we had our grooved brain coral. And we actually had our staghorn coral that was raised here at the Florida Aquarium spawn in this lab at 3 years of age. So these corals were brought here as larvae in 2017 and have lived at the Florida Aquarium ever since settlement. And they are now quite large at 3 years of age, and they did actually spawn this past year. So that was really great to see now a second generation of corals spawning in our facility. We first spawned the Atlantic pillar coral here in our induced spawning lab in 2019. And this event really wowed us. We weren't sure that this was going to work for this type of coral species. And this species is really imperiled in Florida. We've lost over 88% of the previously existing colonies on the Florida reef tract to stony coral tissue loss disease. So seeing that this coral spawned in our lab and spawned really well, highly synchronized, almost all the individuals spawned, we were able to make hundreds of thousands of fertilized larvae and now do that 2 years in a row. We really have confidence that we can continue to breed these corals and produce thousands of offspring for restoration in Florida. Pillar coral spawning is unique. This species is what is called a gonochore, which means that male and female colonies are actually separate. So a lot of corals will spawn in a bundle where you see this bundle of eggs and sperm being released at the same time. But the pillar coral, being separate males and females, actually just releases thousands of eggs all in one pulse. It gives you no warning that it's about to happen. And catching it on video is extremely tricky. It took us several days to get the images that we now have in this video. And then if it's a male, it will release sperm in several pulses, which is diluted pretty quickly into the water column. The pillar coral is extremely imperiled in Florida. There's only about 30 genetic individuals left on Florida's coral reef. The majority of this species was lost over the past few years to stony coral tissue loss disease. And many scientists thought that that was going to be it for pillar coral on Florida's coral reef, that they're no longer able to successfully reproduce in the wild. So people really thought that, the few that we had left, that was going to be it for our Florida population of pillar coral, until we were able to partner with our other partners on the Pillar Coral Rescue Project and get these animals into safekeeping and then actually have them reproducing here at our facility 2 years in a row, that gives us new hope that we can keep this species alive in Florida and actually restore it in the future. In the northern portions of Florida's coral reef, the disease has kind of blown through. You still have it in background levels, but it's not at epidemic proportions like it still is in some of the southern portions of our reef. So this is where we'll first look at reintroducing disease-susceptible species and make sure that they do not succumb to this disease shortly after reintroduction. When the corals actually spawn, our team is standing by to collect their eggs and sperm and do what we call assisted fertilization. We'll take the eggs and sperm into the laboratory and combine them at just the right concentration so that we can get a good fertilization rate in the eggs. And the team will measure that fertilization rate and then care for the developing embryos until they become a swimming coral larvae. Those coral larvae are then brought into greenhouse 1 for settlement and rearing in our shallow rearing trays. Here we are in greenhouse number 1, which is our coral rearing greenhouse. So in these tanks behind me, we're actually raising 10 different species of native Florida stony corals, all from the result of spawning events or sexual reproduction. So in this tank, we have a variety of coral babies that were settled here in August and September of 2020. So they're really just a few months old. Here we have our elkhorn corals. So there's actually multiple individuals on this tile. So as these corals start to grow, we will take a small bandsaw and actually cut them up into separated individuals and mount them one per tile, kind of like this individual. That way that each coral has room to grow, and we've kept each coral as a separate genetic individual. If they were allowed to continue to grow next to each other, they can start to fight with one another for resources, and that will actually limit their growth in the long run. So at some point in the rearing of these corals, we do separate the individuals to one per tile. And then once they're separated like this, they can go into our grow out greenhouse to get ready for release. So in these wash basins, we have our pillar coral offspring from August 2020. And the reason we keep them in here is because they are much more sensitive than some of the other species. So they're much smaller at first, but these guys are getting some size to them. So you can actually now see them with the naked eye. This is a very slow growing species and they're very sensitive. So this species, in order to raise it as a sexual recruit and then have it be big enough to have a good chance of survival after reintroduction, it takes about 2 years. So we do have some 2-year-old pillar coral offspring in our other greenhouse that I'll show you in a minute. We're now here in greenhouse 2, and this is our archive and grow out greenhouse. So in this greenhouse, we hold additional parent coral colonies from 11 different species, and some of them will be rotated into our induced spawning lab, and some of them actually spawn right here in our greenhouse. So these pillar corals are 2-year-old sexual recruits. These were actually spawned at the Keys Marine Laboratory in Layton, Florida, and the larvae and eggs were brought back here to the Florida Aquarium for rearing. So these corals have lived here since 2018 and are a good size now to look at returning to Florida's coral reef. The Florida Aquarium Center for Conservation holds over 200 pillar coral fragments in a genetic archive of corals that were collected from Florida's coral reef to save them from stony coral tissue loss disease and to start a managed propagation program for the species. What we have here are our boulder brain coral babies. We recently released 600 of these to the waters in Miami. They were outplanted by our partners at the University of Miami Rosenstiel School, and they'll be monitoring the outplants to make sure that they don't get stony coral tissue loss disease and see how they do overall. In addition to our pillar coral archive, we also house 119 individuals from 11 species that were part of the Florida Coral Rescue Project. And these corals were taken from the lower Keys and the Marquesas and the dry tortugas before stony coral tissue loss disease ever came to that area. So these corals will serve as broodstock or parents for future reproduction efforts here at the Florida Aquarium. Thank you for joining me on our tour of the Florida Aquarium Center for Conservation. And I hope that this tour has inspired you to think what is possible for the future of Florida's coral reef.
What's happening in Florida right now is going to have long-lasting and potentially devastating impacts on our marine ecosystems. What we're seeing is a dramatic event that's happening locally, and it's tying into everything that's happening around the world with our marine ecosystems.
Currently, Florida is undergoing the largest coral disease outbreak ever recorded in the world. And unfortunately, pillar coral is one of the species that is most heavily affected by this disease.
Pillar coral are probably as old as the Florida reef tract. If you go back into the fossil record, there's some evidence that they've been around for a long time. These individuals out here, some of them are hundreds of years old, if not older.
Four years ago, we did some extensive diving up and down the entire range of the Florida reef tract, and pretty confident that we found probably 90 to 95% of all the pillar coral that were around and where they are. We estimate there were about 700 colonies, maybe a little bit more. We are now down to fewer than 100 live colonies on Florida's reef in 4 years. That's how bad it is. And we're expecting they may be extinct here locally in Florida within the next 5 years. There's a huge disconnect in what's going on under the water, because for the most part, you don't see what's going on under the water. With the people that even live here, the locals, a lot of them don't realize how degraded our reefs are and how important they are to our island chain, our livelihoods.
So working with lots of partners, there have been a lot of projects that have gone on to try to save this species. One of them is what we call the Living Ark, and what we do with that, we bring in fragments of these corals from the field and keep them in conditions where they won't be subjected to warm seawater temperatures. They won't be subjected to disease-filled water. And in that way, we hope to preserve those individual genotypes, and we can grow them and make more tissue. There's projects happening to try to breed them so that we can make genetically diverse new individuals. And all of this is with the goal of having the material and the individuals to be able to put back out on the reef when conditions allow for that and potentially restore this species.
We need to start looking at the link between the land and the sea. We cannot have a constant input of fertilizers and organic materials and waste products that just get dumped into the ocean. The solution to pollution is not dilution. There's too much pollution. And we need to take actions to treat our wastewater, retain the wastewater, reuse our wastewater. We cannot simply just dump it into the ocean and forget about it anymore. It's not working.
They're real, they're a living creature. And I think it's our responsibility to do the best we can to care for every living creature in whatever manner we can.